Welcome to the Relationship Chronicles podcast with Nina Westbrook. I'm your host, and I'm here with Dr. Ramani, and I'm so excited to talk about some of the most intriguing topics when it comes to narcissism, and I can't wait to jump in with you. Thanks for coming and joining me early this morning.
Yeah. So it's a little before 7 a.m.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're both up early. You're an early
Yes.
riser.
Yeah.
Well, this is perfect because I actually have a few questions. It's kind of like a this or that
Sure, of course.
icebreaker before we jump into the thick of things. And so I'll go through some of those questions right now.
Great.
So night owl or early bird?
Early bird.
Early bird, clearly. Reality TV or documentaries?
Documentaries.
I could have guessed that, maybe. Private practice or speaking engagements?
Ooh, am I allowed to say both?
I mean, you can do anything you want.
I'm going to say both because it's true. I'd say, yeah. I mean, I would say probably speaking engagements are getting more time consuming now than private practice, but I do both.
Yeah. All the preparation of it all takes a lot of time. Individual therapy or group therapy?
Individual therapy.
Love it. And then yoga or outdoor walks?
If I did either of them, it would be outdoor walks.
Good. Do you do any kind of fitness or active?
It's the greatest sort of failure in my sort of self-care. I was telling someone the other day, I don't have a single unhealthy habit. I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I get plenty of sleep. I'm always careful to get 8 hours. I am very mindful. I eat well. The one thing I don't do is move my body, and at my age that matters. So I sort of have a resolution at the end of this month. I have a massive deadline this month, and I said, I don't care if it's around the block on the treadmill. I've got to start walking. I used to be very, 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 very fit, and then life happened. And so that's something I got to take back. Yeah.
I feel like that's something we could all relate to. Life happening. I'm supposed to be working out and being fit also. So I want to kind of jump in. You are one of the leading experts in narcissism, which is really, really interesting. I feel like a lot of people in the mental wellness, mental health arena have similar stories as to how they kind of got here. Can you share a little bit about your journey?
So, it's an interesting one because people say, oh, you must have come here because you knew this was sort of what was happening to you. And it's actually quite the contrary. I came in a very traditional route. I was, a very good student. And I think, listen, I grew up as a South Asian woman and my parents are immigrants. And they're like, you're going to have doctor in front of your name if it's the last thing you do. So I'd originally thought about med school and I really got interested in psychology. And I was more interested in doing therapy with people than giving them medication, even though psychiatrists do both. And I decided, and I liked research. So I, took a traditional path. I did well. I was going to have a research academic career. I was very fortunate after spending a year at NYU to go to UCLA, which is absolutely a premier doctoral program, and got amazing, amazing training. Worked with amazing people. Really learned it from the ground up. It was almost like you got to be an architect, but you actually learned how to pour a foundation. Like they taught you everything, and so it was great. And I got great clinical training, and I did my clinical training in the UCLA Department of Psychiatry. And it was, I worked at the VA. I got to work with kids. I mean, I really got to get a whole wide breadth of training. I was a traditional academic for 22 years at Cal State LA. So I had a certain path, Nina. And then what got interesting was, but I was trained as a clinician. So I was licensed and I could practice and all that other stuff. And I started a small practice. Actually got back into clinical practice after a little bit of a break when I had kids because I was running a master's program clinically training people. And in order to do that, I had to have a clinical presence. So I started that. And then it was really fascinating. I was running a research program. I was working on someone else's research. And the thing that I was seeing was that there were clients in the research study that were literally making everyone on the research team so frustrated they almost quit. And it jumped out at me that these people, their personalities were not only wanting to make these staffers quit, but they were probably wreaking havoc with everyone. And that led me to become really interested in personality, which nobody thought about. At the same time, I had a bunch of patients in my practice all saying, sort of talking about the same relationship. I thought, why isn't anyone talking to them about narcissism? And as I
Mhm.
kept doing this work, it was the first time I looked up and said, okay, and now we're going to understand your life. I got to tell you, when I started getting into this work, which was sort of in the early to mid 2000s, there was a lot of theoretical work on narcissism, but
Mhm.
nobody was focused on
Mhm.
what happened to the people in the relationships.
Right. I think that what you're saying is so important. And I also feel like it used to be so like taboo to talk about someone being a narcissist or narcissistic personality disorder just because it's such there's no cure. So it was like you had to be very careful when talking about narcissism and labeling people with as narcissists. But when it comes to like the current climate and social media and all of the therapy speak, and I feel like gaslighting being the number one word in 2023 or something crazy like that. I feel like it's become such a thing that people will quickly label and quickly share their opinions and thoughts about someone being a narcissist. How do you feel that has like affected or impacted your work in any way, or the way that we see narcissists, or what it means to be a narcissist?
So the issue is that I think that we still struggle with talking about narcissism. So I
Mm-hmm.
still don't think in the mental health profession people want to talk about it. It's still viewed as stigmatized. It's still
Mm-hmm.
viewed as something that doesn't is not amenable to change because it really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that I think there is pushback in the field. But I think what's happened, unfortunately, in the world at large is now people are applying it to any person who is selfish, any person who might cheat on them, any
Mm-hmm.
person who lies. And that's also an overreach, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty specific constellation of behavior. So, and it's not a one off, right? We all have a bad day. If anyone
Right.
took a snapshot of us on our very worst day, we all could look narcissistic. The
Right.
key is that this behavior is consistent, that it is situation over situation, time over time. And the other rub with narcissism is that it is inconsistently consistent or consistently inconsistent in that narcissistic people, when they feel good, their life is going the way they want, that they're living large, their like career's going well, they're with the partner they want, they feel like they've got enough money, basically they feel sort of safe and validated. They can
Right.
be the most charming, charismatic, lovely people in the world. In fact, people in those relationships feel like they got the fairy tale, they won,
Mm-hmm.
until something goes wrong in that narcissistic person's life. And then heaven help you. Now, you might say, well, isn't that everybody when we're doing great? And no, because this can happen 3 times a day. You wake
Right.
up and the person's nice, then they get a phone call they don't want, and they're criticizing you, and you had nothing to do with that phone call. And then they get another phone call and things are better. And then they're like, yeah, cool, cool, cool. Yeah, no, I was just having a bad morning. And then
Mm-hmm.
they have another stressor and they're like, what's wrong with you? Why are you always asking me these questions? And you're like, what am I in? You might have a great weekend and a terrible Monday. You might have a terrible vacation, and then they show up as the parent of the year. So it's confusing. The thing
Right.
is, though, they never really make amends. They never say, oh, I was not having a good morning and I was not graceful. I am sorry. I know I hurt you. There's never that kind of accountability.
Wow.
See what I'm saying? So it's a pattern, and other people slowly notice it. And so, but because there are so many good days, people rationalize it. They're busy, they're under a lot of stress, they had a tough
Mm-hmm.
childhood. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really complicated. And there's no way a 3-minute TikTok video is going to be able to explain this. And I think anybody out there who's had a cheating boyfriend's like, well, I'm going to make a video about narcissism. And I want to say, slow down, sister. Like, let's break this one
Mm-hmm.
down.
Right, right. I absolutely agree. And I feel like this was one of the main questions that I wanted to ask you is how do so many people find themselves in relationships with people who are narcissists? And you just answered that question. I feel like the honeymoon phase, or the excitement and joy and getting to know someone and starting to date someone, and then coupled with this idea that we don't want to share our full selves quite yet.
Hmm.
Maybe we don't feel as comfortable being vulnerable or having bad days around this person, all the while, you're leading up to these disappointments that are going to happen, the letdowns that are going to happen, and then the behaviors that come after. And
Hmm.
you're like, wait a minute, how did I get in this situation? And I feel like a lot of people blame themselves
Yeah.
and like are confused as to how they could end up in a situation or in a relationship with someone, and how could they not see the signs. But it is a very, very tricky thing to be able to recognize um, these signs early on. Is there anything that you would say that's helpful? Is like anything to look out for aside from kind of the time aspect and the patterns over longer periods of time?
You're asking such a big question, Nina. And I wanted there to be red flags. I wish
Right.
there were, and there really aren't. And the reason I say this is twofold. That I think a lot of people out there beat themselves up and say, why didn't I see the red flags? I'm like, oh, because they probably weren't there. I was talking with someone recently and they had been in a relationship with someone and they said to me, Doc, I am not kidding you, for 14 months. And I'd been talking to that person for the full 14 months. They said, not one. It wasn't like I was holding back. There was nothing. They were on time. They were respectful. They were always in touch with me. They were solicitous. When I was sick, they took care of me. When my mom was in town, they were so present. There was nothing shady until there was. And that was about a little over a year in. And what I try to tell folks is there's a couple of things wrong with what I call the red flags model. When we talk about red flags, we basically put the onus on the person who's not the abuser, but the person being abused, right? Like, you should be able to see this. Why should they? Maybe the other person shouldn't be behaving like this, first of all. But
Mm-hmm.
second of all, narcissism's a funny thing because they really can keep it together. These are not psychotic people. These are
Right.
not severely mentally ill people. They can be. You can have both narcissism and a severe mental illness. But in
Mm-hmm.
many template cases, these are people who are showing up in life very successful, very
Mm-hmm.
ambitious,
Mm-hmm.
with large social circles, with families, all of that. But and so people will say, well, they kept it together for that long. Isn't that a long time? No, because in the early phase of a relationship, they're getting all the novelty, all the supply, right? Narcissistic people love novelty. And when this person who was talking to me about this 14-month relationship, she said, listen, the subtle things that happen, I would have never called these red flags. When I look back, I could see that he was a little arrogant in some of his opinions. He was a
Mm-hmm.
little bit bossy when we went to a restaurant, but like he always tipped generously. And
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm saying? So the way she sort of smoothed it out made sense. And I said, listen, you can't jump on every time somebody is a little off. Like, that would also be a weird way to live. So
Right.
I tell people on average, unless somebody is glaringly in your face narcissistic, it can take some people up to a year to figure it out, sometimes even two. And the problem with that is now you're in pretty deep. There are some sort of, like, I'm going to call pink flags, maybe, like things you might notice. You might notice that somebody is pretty early in the relationship, they talk over you a lot. When you're talking, they sort of look away. They have inappropriate boundaries with other people. You'll be out with them, but they'll sort of be inappropriate with other people, and you'll say, "What is this?" And then they'll say, "What's wrong with you? Like, you're so old fashioned. This is,"
Mm-hmm.
and you'll feel like you're the one with something wrong with you. There could be snobbery. There can be entitlement, maybe mistreating a server in a restaurant or a flight attendant on an airplane, or at least being rude to them, very demanding, dismissive, being contemptuous, talking about people in a really cruel way, like not just joking, like, aha, look at that guy's hat, but like really saying things that you're like, woo. I'll be
Yeah.
honest with you. When somebody says they hear racist stuff from people or any discriminatory stuff, that's a red flag. Racism and discrimination are strongly correlated with narcissism. So, I mean, there are these little things that can get dropped, and then where you could say, and I always tell people, and you know this too, being in the mental health world, is you got to listen to your body. I mean, if you meet someone and you're like, there's something here, like they're so cool and so interesting and so attractive, I just feel like I always view it as like, if you get a puzzle piece in perfectly, it snaps right in. You feel like the
Mhm.
puzzle piece in your body that hasn't, you're like, it kind of fits, but it's not snapping in. Like, pay attention to that sort of disconnect. But beyond that, I have to be honest with you, unless someone's really, really bad, it can take a year to notice.
Hi, friends. I would love to talk to you about Peerspace. Peerspace has over 40,000 spaces available in cities around the world. I was able to work with them to bring my podcast streams to life for all of my in person recordings. I wanted to choose a space that I felt was open, airy, bright, and just overall felt good. In doing so, I was able to create a space where my guests could feel open, comfortable, and vulnerable when sharing about all the significant things happening in their lives. When it comes to you, make sure you choose the space that works best for you and that's going to help bring your project to life. Peerspace was kind enough to offer 15% off for all of our listeners on your next Peerspace booking when you use the link in the description by September 30th. Yeah, and that can be so taxing because once you're in it, like you said, once you're fully invested in a relationship with someone who is a narcissist, you want to makes you feel like you want to work on the relationship. It makes you feel
Yeah.
like you have to do everything you can. You're going to hang on to it much longer than maybe you
Mhm.
should. What are some things I like the relationship aspect, but I'm also very interested in how that plays out in the familial setting and how having narcissistic parents and their children and what that looks like in adulthood. And I'll get there right after this, but since we're here, what can someone do when they are in a relationship? Time has passed; they're fully invested in this relationship. What are some of the things that they can do to help, like, cope and deal with being in that relationship if they choose to stay?
Yeah. So let's start from, basics is that a lot of people choose to stay. I think a lot of people feel a certain sense of shame if they stay. What's wrong with me? Am I a doormat? Am I a codependent?
Mhm.
No, you may very well be staying for very real practical reasons. And, I'm really tired of the discourse like, if it's bad enough, you'll leave. And I'm not talking about physical abuse. I want to put that aside because obviously that's a different conversation. But I'm
Mhm.
talking about the sort of emotionally taxing, toxic stuff that happens in these relationships.
Right.
It's not that simple. We're talking about money. We're talking about social, like, you're standing within your family, within your community. We're talking about culture, religion, safety. When a
Mhm.
person in a more severe narcissistic relationship, if a person leaves, that's actually when things can really heat up and become awful. We're talking about a family court system that doesn't know from narcissism. So there's a lot of practical reasons people stay. And then there are things like where they say, you know what? There have been good times and it's hard to meet people. And am I ready to walk away from 10, 20, 30 years of history? So there is no shame in staying. But if a person stays, they have to stay with their eyes wide open. And the most central element of that is radical acceptance. Unless you're dealing with a unicorn, in most cases, narcissistic personality is very resistant to change. In essence, what you see is what you get. This is
Right.
not going to shift a lot. Now, if you have the unicorn, the person says, I don't like how I treat you. I don't have enough empathy for you. I better go to therapy. A, that person may not even be that narcissistic. And B, great, good for you. But that's almost like winning the lottery into a retirement plan. Probably not the way it's going to go.
Right.
So I think that to remember that because it's resistant to change, if you stay, this isn't going to change. And all of this behavior is them. There's nothing you can do to change their behavior. And that's the realistic expectations. It is going to be a roller coaster ride. Narcissistic people do not have the capacity for depth, closeness, and consistency and what we call mutuality. They don't hold
Mhm.
up their side of the table, basically, in a relationship. So it will never be a deep relationship. It'll be superficial. The trains will be running on time. You'll be raising the kids. It'll be inequitable. And so you know that. And that might mean if you have some resources, you get some help with the kids. If you don't have resources, you be really organized. It also means that a person needs to build up other supports in their life. And this piece is crucial. because the narcissistic relationship will steal your identity. You'll be gaslighted. You'll always be on your back foot. You'll always wonder what is wrong with me. And if
Mm-hmm.
you need those healthy places where you're like, oh, actually, nothing is wrong with me. I am
Right.
a functioning empathic person. Now, that support may be in the form of friends. It might be healthy family members. It might be therapy. It might be support groups. It might be a religious community. But that one space where you can show up authentically as yourself and be seen is a critical offset to what happens in these kinds of relationships if you stay.
Right. I feel like that crucial part is the therapeutic part and the building of confidence and structure and just having a world outside of the relationship because you're going to rely and depend on it so much for your own sanity. Before we jump into children of narcissists and how that typically might play out into their adulthood, can you kind of give us like the four main types of narcissism?
hmm So when we talk about narcissism as a whole, okay, narcissistic people, types, no types, just in general, are people with variable, inconsistent, and shallow empathy, or it's performative empathy. They're entitled, arrogant, grandiose, egocentric, constantly seeking validation and admiration. They can have very discontrolled emotions. They get angry very quickly. They can be, they need to have a lot of control. They need to be dominant. And all of this, though, all of this kind of like angry, entitled, grandiose, also can be very charming and charismatic, is like a suit of armor around a very core insecurity and inadequacy. And
Mhm.
so anytime that sense of shame pops up and it turns out they're not perfect, that is too much for them to bear. And that's when that entitlement, arrogance all really shows up strong. Okay. So that's
Mhm.
every narcissistic person, but it shows up differently. And most often, our image of a narcissist is the grandiose narcissist, arrogant, preening, pretentious, very concerned with their appearance, very concerned with their status. It's the flashy cars, it's the flashy look, it's the flashy this, and it's, kind of always talk about themselves and talking these grand, like, I'm the man, I'm the greatest, I'm the this, I'm the that. They can only talk about themselves. They have very little interest in other people, but they're so charming and charismatic, they kind of get away with it.
Mhm.
That's the grandiose narcissist. And that, again, because most people view that prototype, they miss some of the others. The second would be the vulnerable narcissist. And the vulnerable narcissist is sort of, they'd often coexist with the grandiose person, but if a person is primarily vulnerable, these are the narcissistic people. They're sometimes called covert narcissists because you don't pick up on it. But the
Mhm.
vulnerable narcissist is, they're more anxious, resentful, sullen, angry, and chronically victimized. So instead of the grandiose narcissist walks around saying, "I'm the best, I'm the man, I'm going to pick up the check for everyone because I'm the man," the
Mhm.
vulnerable narcissist will be like, life has been so unfair to me. You know why? You know what? I could be living in that big house if I'd had a trust fund, but I
Yeah.
didn't have a trust fund, and it makes me sick how people don't have to work. And why should I pick up the check? So you all can take advantage of me. So always victim, victim, victim. But
Mhm.
still, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, and the grandiosity comes out not as, look how great I'm doing and showing you their fancy house, but in fact might be more like, I could have had a better house, but I don't. And it's much more wounded. Then there's the communal narcissist. Communal narcissist is interesting. These are the people that get their validation and admiration by being by saving the world or saving other people. So these are people who will claim to be these grand humanitarians, but the only reason they're doing their sort of humanitarian thing is to get admiration and validation. And if they
Mhm.
don't get that admiration and validation, they're going to get angry real fast. So it's not
Oh.
like they said, I'm doing this work for the love of the work, right? It's not that. They'll say, How come more people didn't like my post? How come more people didn't give to my cause? And you're thinking, well, because man, maybe that's not their cause. Like, it's great that you're doing it, and that's not why they're doing it. And
And that would
so,
be fine. I like a communal narcissist as long as they don't get angry and like
well,
it.
then they're not a communal narcissist, right? Then they're just a giving person. And so you'll see this in a lot. And so these people will be hiding sometimes in spiritual spaces, so they'll say, oh, I'll come heal you, I'm some guru, blah blah blah. I mean, I always tell people, you hear the word guru, you should run away. I say this as a Indian woman, like, it's a very kind of grandiose kind of a name, term.
Mhm.
And so it's a so these are people who, again, they are also, the communal narcissistic people are actually quite awful to people individually, like the people who are helping them on their so-called mission. And so,
Mhm.
they're not nice people. And you'll see that there are people say, yeah, I worked on this political campaign with someone who claimed they were going to help, the vulnerable in the population, and they mistreated everyone on the campaign staff. So a great example of communal narcissism. The most severe, and I would say potentially the most dangerous form of narcissism, shows up in malignant narcissism. And malignant narcissism is really where we see people who almost look more psychopathic. They're much more interpersonally exploitative. They're much more calculating. They can be much more coercive. Here, we might still see some of the charm and charisma, but we also see a lot of control and a lot of menace. Sort of like, they'll early in a relationship with a malignant narcissist, it may very well be that they're very, very controlling to the point of paranoid. Like, why are those people on your social media feed? Or why'd you even look at that guy like that? They'll do something like buy someone a phone. It's mostly because it's got a tracker on it. Take a picture where you're at, baby. Take a picture where you're at. I want to see that you're there. It's that kind of thing. So it'll
Wow.
seem romantic, but in fact, it's really sort of this controlling, trying to confirm that a person is where they say there'll be very little trust. And over time, these relationships of the one subtype of narcissism that's most likely to become more, the abuse could escalate to the point where it's dangerous, would be with malignant narcissism.
Wow. When you just said take a picture where you're at and send it to me so I can see where you're at, that does not sound romantic to me at all.
But what's sad, and this is where we need so much education for young people, because you'll see that kind of that idea that an early relationship should be, we're together 24/7, we're enveloped in
Mhm.
each other, and so if somebody believes that kind of intensity is what a
Mhm.
love story looks like, and then
Mhm.
in the same breath it kind of tracks, right? Like, "Oh, you got to FaceTime me when you wake up, you got to FaceTime me when you go to bed." And in
Mhm.
fact, on their side, on the narcissistic person side, it's to make sure there's no one else in that bed with you, and
Right.
you're in your own bed, right? Whereas
Mhm.
the person in the relationship might say, "Oh my gosh, they're so
He's
into
thinking
me."
about me this morning, and every
Yeah,
night he wants to
yeah,
talk to me before bed.
yeah.
I can totally understand how that gets misconstrued or
Hmm.
can be overlooked.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm here to share with you my go to foundational nutrition supplement, AG1. It is amazing for so many reasons, but mainly because it is a whole body health supplement. This means I'm maintaining my immune system, my gut health, my energy, and more. I love AG1 because it comes in a packet. I'm not really big on taking a lot of vitamin supplements. I find it really hard to keep up with them. It comes in lots of different forms, but I like the packet because I can slip it in my bag and take it with me and make sure that I'm always taking it. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1 year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/relationship chronicles. That's drinkag1.com/relationship chronicles and check it out. As it pertains to the family unit, can you share what it might look like for a child who grew up with one or two parents who are narcissists as they kind of try to grow up and navigate through their adult lives, what that might look like for them?
So having a narcissistic parent is a pretty awful legacy
Mhm.
because the narcissistic parent never allows the child to develop into their own full identity. The child really becomes a source of narcissistic supply for the parent. So if the child is a successful extension of the parent, the child looks the way the parent wants, does well in school the way the parent wants, does sports or athletics or dance or performance, something the way the parent wants, that child has a good chance of being a golden child, of almost being potentially overindulged by that parent. But the
Mhm.
child at some inherent level knows this is a pay to play situation. As long as I do what this person wants, I'll be in their good books. But if I decide to go and be my own person, so if that, I don't know, athletically gifted kid all of a sudden turns to parent, narcissistic parent, and says, I don't know, like I'm not feeling like I like this anymore, and I really have this interest in singing and dancing, that parent will go cold, right? That kind
Mhm.
of thing. But it's deeper than that. These are parents who they resent that their child needs anything from them. The parent really thinks it's all about them. And so if the child has needs, emotions, feelings, experiences that are not consistent with the parents, then that narcissistic parent will often shame the child and resent the needs. Now, when we're in adult relationships and someone says this to us, we can tell them to go, where. But
Mhm.
in a child relationship, the child has attachment needs. The child has to have an attachment to a caregiver. So if the only game in town is a narcissistic parent, they're going to have to find the workarounds so they can maintain that attachment with that parent that is so selfish, that is so negating. What does the child do? They assume they're the bad one. They start squelching those parts of their identity. They silence themselves. They learn appeasing and giving in is love. That's the only way to make a relationship work. And we'll hear people say, well, what if a person has one narcissistic parent and one healthy parent? That helps. It definitely
Mhm.
helps. But you've now witnessed a relationship where the narcissistic parent was constantly berating the other parent. So
Right.
you're witness of a relationship that's not a healthy relationship. Does that mean all is lost? Absolutely not. I've seen plenty of adult survivors of these parental relationships go on to really kind of take themselves back, but that can only be done in therapy. And it's deep, deep work
Right.
to not feel afraid to bring your true self out, because the belief is if I bring my true self out, I'm going to be negated or resented. So a human relationship means I have to push myself down. And so to bring the true self up is actually quite terrifying because you immediately think it's going to be knocked down. So there's a lot of work in developing that sort of authentic self and giving it permission.
And not only that, I feel like it's almost a choice and a decision that has to be made to be willing to break off from a parent, because how often can a child of a severely
Yeah,
narcissistic parent grow up and learn their autonomy and become independent without the parent,
right, right.
with the parents, blessing? That doesn't happen often, right?
I think no, it'll never happen. See, I think
Right.
that what you bring up in this issue, and again, we talked about can you stay and leave in the relationship more in intimate relational space. I mean, the only thing harder than leaving a long-term relationship is splitting up with a parent.
Right.
This idea that people are going to get up and walk away from their families is some do. Some do. Some people say my life began when I went no contact with my parent. Okay, that's wonderful, and I can absolutely see how that would happen. But not
Hmm.
everyone feels they can do that. They may feel responsible in a caregiving role. They may feel culturally beholden. They may feel guilted. They may feel shamed. They may feel judged. There's a whole host of reasons. And so people who still have to stay in that parent sphere are going to feel, I mean, I think that for every one of us within us is that small child that is
Hmm.
still looking for the parents' approval, right? I have seen grown men who are absolute titans in what they do, and they're still waiting for their dad to approve of them. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you run like 5,000 employees, you're worth what? And that still matters to them, is what you're thinking. But you're like, oh my gosh, there's still that kid in them. And as a result, until we say it's not like we'll ever get rid of that kid, is we have to hold grace for that child and say this is, and it might even be what drove some of these people to be so successful, was to be seen. Same radical acceptance, Nina. That parent is not coming around. There's not going to be that hallmark deathbed moment where they're like, I finally see you. I see how wonderful you are. I mean, in most cases I've worked with, right to the very end, the narcissistic parent was negating and invalidating. And so, and some people say, I like the one parent, I don't like the other. So I've got to stay in touch. Or in order to see my nieces and nephews, that sibling is still close with that parent. So families are
Mhm,
complicated. And it's
mhm.
really and so a lot of people will say that I had to, once again, I had to learn not to engage. I don't share as much of myself so they can tear me down. I know who I am, or have to really engage in some serious self compassion and self care after these interactions because they're left feeling less than after they happen.
Right, right. And that's why I feel like it's the most difficult dynamic to really work with because as a child, you can't really work with the child. You have to kind of wait. The trauma's already there.
Yeah.
And then you're trying to correct and go back, which, like you said, it takes such deep work. So it's a very tricky dynamic to be working with. Okay, so a lot of the things you described, and a lot of people who don't quite who are not as well versed in the mental health diagnoses and whatever the case may be, might confuse a lot of the characteristics or the traits of narcissism with other mental diagnoses like borderline personality disorder.
Mhm.
And I feel like a lot of people use the word like psychopath or whatever to describe um, narcissistic behaviors. Can you share some of the differences or why they're different?
So, they are and they aren't different, and that's part of the challenge here, right? So there's been a lot of argument that sort of there's an undercurrent across a lot of personality disorders, personality styles, where there's a lot of commonality. So there's a very, very, very high co-occurrence of borderline symptoms in people who are narcissistic and vice versa. In fact, I argue that they're on the same continuum. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerable narcissism and borderline personality actually present very similarly. The big difference between vulnerable narcissism and borderline personality is probably a more severe variant where we see more of the suicidality and that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so the kinds of things like difficulty managing anger, emotional dysregulation, manipulative behavior in relationships, fear of abandonment, tons and tons of overlaps, right? And so what I often say is like, you'll have clients that are purely narcissistic, clients with a lot of narcissistic borderline overlap, and then clients that are more purely borderline. So it's a continuum, right? One feeds
Mm-hmm.
into the other. So it is, from a clinical perspective, in a way, it doesn't matter in the sense that you figure out treatment targets. Like, okay, this person's suicidal. That's an acute target. This person's really dysregulated and blowing up all their relationship. That's a treatment target. This person is showing no empathy. We have to work on empathy enhancement or,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, regulation of self, you name it. We break it down. It's not like, oh, this person's narcissistic and there's some narcissism toolkit, breaking it down by behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's what you call the psychopathy. It's very interesting, Nina. I was looking at some research recently, and the research was showing sort of how all these personality styles overlap. There's actually an overlap between even borderline and psychopathy, definitely an overlap between narcissism and psychopathy. And so psychopathy, though, is a very rare in the population relative to narcissism or borderline. We're talking about 1%. And
Mm-hmm.
psychopathy, it's the all the stuff of narcissism, but you have this absence of remorse and you also don't have the insecurity. People who are
Mm-hmm.
psychopaths, you see what I'm saying? So the
Mm-hmm.
psychopathic people are almost that cold, callous, calculating, but also because they don't have that anxiety, they can do terrible things without remorse. So
Mm-hmm.
these could be the serial offenders who just, as soon as they come out, they're perpetrating crimes right away. They could be people who perpetrate white collar crimes without conscience, without awareness of or care really of how it's hurting other people. They're not
Mm-hmm.
as afraid of getting caught. They're not often thinking about consequences in the same way, but can also be incredibly intelligent, charming. The charming is very superficial. It's just enough to get in there and be able to fleece someone. I would say that with narcissism, we see more guilt, we see more shame, we see more of those negative emotions. So, but the manipulation, the exploitation, the coldness, the lack of empathy, that's an overlap, right? So
Right.
you can see all of these things kind of hang out together, and trying to separate them kind of becomes a pointless exercise because you're separating. It's almost like saying, okay, here's a person, I'm going to pull off their arm. Yeah, they're still a person, but the arm is part of them, or
Mm-hmm.
pull out their hair. I mean, their hair is a part of them. They're still a person. And so the same thing here, as you pull these things apart, it's an artificial dichotomy or trichotomy. They're related. All these things are related. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but these words are thrown around. Just because someone cheats on you, that doesn't make them a psychopath, right?
Right.
Just because somebody lies to you about, I don't know, they said they were going to pay you back on Monday and they didn't, that doesn't make them a psychopath, right? I
Right.
mean, so again, we need lots of behavior to be able to use these terms. And the other thing you brought up is, we're going back and forth between this idea of personality and personality disorder. Personally, I think that I'm not even a fan of narcissistic personality disorder being a thing. If
Mm-hmm.
anything, maybe we just keep the vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
narcissistic. And then I think that's more like borderline, anyhow, where I think
Mm-hmm.
there's more clear that there's a true phenomenon there. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that nobody out there gets to talk about NPD unless they've spent 6 months in a therapy room, week over week over week. It takes me, I mean, I do this. It would take
Mm-hmm.
me 3 to 6 months, sometimes a year.
I was gonna ask you how long it take. Like, how long do you think? Like, what's a sufficient amount of time before you could even go about diagnosing someone with any of these personality disorders?
Long time. I mean, I think it takes a long time. And it's interesting. I'd worked with mental health professionals who work in jails and prisons. And, with them, they almost have a strange, if you will, advantage because they often have the incarceration history of this person, right? They have the offending history of this person. So they're saying, okay, they've been doing this since they were a kid.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have a quicker behavioral lens, at least in the psychopathy, antisocial behavior piece of this. But when it comes to narcissism, I actually did once have a client walk in and say on the first session, I'm narcissistic, and he was right. But by and large, you kind of got to get there. And yes, if they're more grandiose and more arrogant, it does become clearer earlier on. But you can't jump to that conclusion. We've got to sort of understand how they go through their relationships, what their developmental history was like, how this individual copes. So if my only focus in that room, I'm not dating them or I'm not in a relationship with them, and it's still taking us a few months, you're beginning to see how it's going to take a person just in a regular relationship with someone a year, because that's not the first place we should go to.
Right. I appreciate that information. I think it's so important, especially when you're talking about these personality disorders. Hi, friends. I'm here to chat with you about Prime Video. Prime Video is entertainment for you, every you. There's the you that can light up the stage like Mrs. Maisel, but there's also the you that just wants a lazy brunch with your girls in Harlem. Prime Video is for the teenager falling in love you who turned pretty one summer, and the 30 something who knew she had it going on all along. For the dreamer in you who gets lost in the wheel of time, and the fan who dreams of playing in the WNBA. The strong in you who can best the boys like Starlight, and the not so strong you who can't get through an episode of Swarm without covering your eyes. We're here for the messy, the marvelous, and everything in between. World changing, nap taking, role breaking you. Just as you are, Prime Video is entertainment for you, every you. Restrictions apply. See Amazon.com/Amazon Prime for details. I want to ask a question I feel like the listeners would really want to know and hear and benefit from, which is this idea of whether a narcissist could be capable of true love, or can someone have a successful relationship with a narcissist, and successful in the way that you would define a
Correct. I understand.
successful relationship.
You want a short answer to that? I'm going with no. Okay. If you want the more elaborated answer, which I think is fair, is one of the biggest problems with love is that we very rarely have a shared definition. I think it was Bell Hooks that said that, right? If we were talking about love, so I'm garbling
That's
it
why
really
it got my quotation marks.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, it's the shared. I'm convinced it's bell hooks because I know I cited her in my book. So, um, it's this idea of having this idea of a shared definition, and we don't. I mean, I don't think any of us do. For some people, love means showing up. For other people, it's like, again, we talk about this love language stuff, which I think is a superficial take on this, but we express it differently. It means different things to us. And I think part of the problem in our culture and society is we conflate true love with romance, right? Excitement, the Instagram of it all. Look at us on vacation. Look at us lying in bed. I'm like, what does equity look like in this relationship? How are you supporting, are you able to be present with each other's perspectives even when they're different? Do you feel safe in this relationship? That, I don't see that happening. I mean, I really, really don't. I just don't think it's what they're wired for. And this is where it gets tricky because I have worked with clients over many years who will say, there is no depth here. Now that I understand what a relationship is supposed to be, we don't teach people. We actually still teach people some sort of Disneyfied checklist model of relationship. Does this person make money? Are they going to be a provider? Are they going to be, are they going to look good? Do they have a good job? Do they come from a good family? That's what we keep getting stuck on, even in 2023. Right? Nobody is stopping to think like, is this respectful? Do I feel safe? Is this person compassionate? Do I feel heard? That kind of thing. So it's I do have to say that we're not even teaching that part right. So that idea of a deep, sustaining, mutually beneficial true love, no. Might it be we get to go on nice vacations and stay in nice hotels and we have a nice house? Sure. I mean, I think that, and here's the thing, Nina, no judgment. Some people say, I've worked with clients, they say, I grew up dirt poor. Money matters to me. Money is safety to me. And this person, there is no depth. But I do know this. I will never be in a situation like I was as a child. Absolutely no shame in that. What I want for that client then is to understand, though, that there may still be a yearning for you, that you're not getting an emotional need met, but maybe a material need met. Those aren't the same thing. And it's okay to want to feel safe materially, but it's not okay to have to endure abuse to have that material safety. So it's complicated and it's nuanced. And doing this work with clients, going through these relationships, means really that you meet them where they're at without shame, without judgment. These clients are carrying people who are in narcissistic relationships, not the narcissist themselves, but people in narcissistic relationships feel so much shame, especially when they stay. And so I think that it is, but no, it's not true. It's not a true, deep, sustaining, healthy love. It may serve a function for a person, but it also can harm a person a lot.
Okay. I feel like that is a good place to end things. Short answer, no. And
long answer is it's complicated.
long answer, it's complicated. And I kind of I feel like that's a good question to leave off on out of my own personal interest. What do you think is like the most common misconception? Would you say that that might be it? Is that you can find or form some type of really deep, meaningful, loving connection with someone who is a narcissist?
No, I think the most common misconception is that I will be able to change them.
Mm, okay. Well, that's one aspect of it, right?
Yeah, that's one aspect of what you're saying. And I think that the other misconception is that narcissism is about people who stare in the mirror and take selfies. And I think that
Uh-huh.
that's plenty of narcissistic people don't take selfies, and plenty of people take selfies and are not narcissistic. So I think when we fall into these simplistic, I think that we'll often castigate and be quite cruel to people who, I don't know, they're selling their pies on Instagram, or they like to post about their lives. I mean, it's that if they're solid, whole, empathic, good, well-regulated, compassionate, self-aware people, post your breakfast every day. That's fine. But I think that our knee-jerk reaction of, oh, that person just talked about themselves, they're narcissistic. That person posted a selfie, they're narcissistic, really gets us away from what this really is. And this is a pattern that really is not, actually, frankly, it's not good for the narcissists themselves. It's not healthy for them in the long term. And it's definitely not healthy for the people in relationships with them.
Really. And I agree. And I feel like a lot of people, what they don't understand and realize about a narcissist is that at the core of it, like you said so many times, is insecurity. Their own insecurities are at the core of it. And when you're able to, whether it's a family member, a friend, a sibling, a parent, when you're able to approach and understand things from that level, you're able to have a little bit more empathy for them and yourself in the relationship when you're dealing with a narcissist. I
Right.
feel.
Right. And I think for anyone in these relationships, though, it's really working on the empathy for self first, because most people in these relationships have given all of their empathy away to the narcissistic person, thinking if I
Mm-hmm.
do more, be more, say more, be better, I can make this work. There's nothing you can do to make this work. Like, this is it. It's almost like an old car, right? I'm like, this is
Mm-hmm.
it, folks. This thing's going to keep breaking down, but it might get you.
Lemon? Like a
Huh?
lemon? It's like
It's
a
a
lemon?
little bit like it's like a lemon. And again, I hate to be that dismissive about it in a person, but like I said, they're having their own journey. But I think one of the big problems, Nina, is a lot of narcissistic people don't seek out mental health care. They're too grandiose. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're not doing the work. So the
Mm-hmm.
one person, I remember someone once said narcissistic personality disorder is the only mental health condition where everyone else goes into therapy. And it's true, right? And so if, there's one thing people will sometimes say, I'm in a long-term relationship with a narcissist or I have a narcissistic parent, but they are getting up and going to therapy. And even though I know this relationship will never be deep, I'm seeing some shifts. And because of the history I have with this person, it's enough. It's not healthy, but it's enough. So sometimes even seeing that good faith goes a long way. But in the vast majority of cases, you just don't see the good, or they'll go to therapy 3 times and stop going. And so
Mm-hmm.
you'll see that kind of, that sort of
Resistance.
approach. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I thank you so much. I feel like this was so informative, and it's going to be really great for all of our listeners to hear more about it.
Thank you
And
so much.
I mean, I enjoy your Instagram and social media
Thank
accounts
you.
and anything else. Is there anything else that you want to share about what you have going on?
I'd love to. First of all, I have a podcast as well, Navigating Narcissism, where we interview so many interesting people on their narcissistic relationships and a whole bunch of different insights. So please tune into that. I have a YouTube channel where it's pretty much anything and everything you've ever wanted to know about narcissism. So it's just Dr. Ramani. Go tune into that. And for people who are in narcissistic relationships, we actually have a healing program, an online healing program for that. And if people want to go check that out, go to my website. And we've had thousands of people go through the program, and they've really, it's a place of community. It's also a place of information. You get questions answered. So you can check that out too. And I have a new book coming out in February. So maybe as that gets closer, I'll come back and talk to you about that.
Yes, we'll have everything in the descriptions, everything you just
Great.
named in the descriptions for everyone looking for more information.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Gina.
Thank
Such a pleasure.
you. It
Thank
was
you.
such a pleasure to meet you.